Now, the federal government this week had announced plans to offer more tax incentives to Nigerians through the forthcoming 2020 finance bill due to the current economic climate exacerbated by the devastating impact of the coronavirus pandemic. The Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, Zainab Ahmed, had explained that the incentives will include a reduction in duties on tractors, cars and trucks for conveying goods. But these proposals, according to her, captured in the 2020 Finance Bill President Buhari is about to transmit to the National Assembly for legislation. Well, joining me now to discuss and shed more light on these developments in line with the revenue drive of the federal government to fund the 2021 budget is an Associate Director at Anderson Tax, Michael Ango. Good morning, Mr. Ango. Thank you for joining us on the program. Now, how much of a relief will these proposed plans by the federal government provide to surmount the headwinds from the recent economic downturn and low revenue?
Good morning, BC. So first, before we discuss that, I think we should first commend the federal government for bringing out the bill in a timely manner. We've gotten the bill in November, and it's hoped that when it gets to the parliament, it will get attended to in due time to be passed before the start of the next fiscal year. In terms of the actual, waivers and incentives in the bill, I think the reality is that the government is caught between a rock and a hard place. And the reality is that government has seen its revenue drop significantly in the last 1 year due to a combination of factors. We had the COVID-19 crisis, of course, crude oil prices dropped. We've had protests in some of our major cities and all of that. So government revenue has significantly dropped. But here again, government is faced with the reality that it must stimulate business, it must stimulate economic activity in the economy so that people can begin to earn income and, of course, ultimately pay taxes to government. So in that regard, I think the idea of giving out the waivers is, it means by government to stimulate development or growth in certain areas. From where I sit, and this is me speaking as someone who is involved in taxation, I think the waivers are just enough in the sense that they're not as far as people would have wanted them to go. But you must also look at things from the perspective of government, that government cannot be seen to be giving out everything at this point in time. But I think for the issue of duty waivers, for example, on motor vehicles, on tractors, that is a very significant one. We've had duty waivers in import duty from 35% reduced down to 10% for vehicles used in the movement of passengers and then goods. And for tractors, we've had it reduced from 35 to 5%. So that's a very significant drop. And then what is expected is that, because there's been increase in crude in pump price of petroleum, that people will then, be able to use mass transits to move around our major cities. And so it is hoped that those who import these vehicles will then be able to import them and pay lower duty rates. For the tractors, it is understandable. One of the pillars of this government's economic development programs has been agric. So it is expected that if people can, import agricultural implements like tractors at very low duty rates, then this would also, impact their abilities to produce agric produce. There are other things, for example, like the reduction in the minimum tax rate. It's been reduced by 50%. So previously, the minimum tax rate was 0.5. It's now been reduced to 0.25. There's also been, for example, the, designation of animal feed as a basic food item under the Value Added Tax Act. So that is also very significant in the sense that persons who have previously been involved in production of animal feed have been agitating that animal feed should be designated as a basic food item. So to that extent, companies involved in production of animal feed and even users, poultries, people who are into livestock production and all that would I think, benefit to the extent that the exemption is on animal feed. So if you look at it holistically, you would say, yes, kudos to government. But as always, as the Oliver Twist that we tend to be, people might say that, look, the government could have done more. But like I earlier said, you have to also balance things. Government needs revenue for its programs. And so I think this is the extent that government will be able to go for the next fiscal year.
I'm glad you referred once again to the fact that government needs revenues. And when you look at this now, these incentives and waivers for companies now, how would it affect the revenue drive of the federal government when only months ago the president had complained about the inability of his government to generate the needed revenue to fund the budget?
Well, as someone who's not only been involved in tax consulting, I've also worked in government, on the revenue side. I can tell you that the revenue of government from the tax, from tax revenue is already impacted. Like I mentioned earlier, crude oil prices dropped significantly. And then, of course, economic activity slowed down with the lockdowns from March up to about maybe September, October, when the economy began to, kickstart. So government revenue is already impacted, and there's no hiding from that. Again, even for the next fiscal year, things like income tax is going to be significantly impacted because it is the economic activity that has gone on in this year that will, relate, that will then create taxes on income that companies will be paying in the next tax filing period, which comes up in June. So the truth is that government revenue is already impacted. What is important is for government to put in initiatives that can quickly stimulate economic activity. How government is going to do that, again, is left to the economic experts. But what I know is that there are still, sectors of the economy that haven't been as impacted as others. So we know, for example, that during the lockdown, people had to resort to buying things, online and all that. So there's the idea that digital businesses, online businesses saw a boost. Banking services too, people had to transact a lot of their activities offline and online rather, they couldn't walk into the banks and all of that, but people were at home. So the banks, it is believed that they made a lot of money from, bank charges and online transactions and all of that. So there's some sectors of the economy that maybe government would like to look very closely at and see if they can realize additional revenue from those sectors. But generally speaking, if you look at the economy as a whole, I do not think that there's a lot of room for government to, get additional tax revenue. What is important probably is for government to then be realistic in its revenue targets, to say, yes, because of what has happened in the last 12 months, etc., we have to put realistic targets for the next 1 year and then watch how it goes. But what is important is to also ensure that all the loopholes are closed. The new VAT of 7.5%, which is operational, should be collected. It should be implemented. I think that is an opportunity. The efforts to also realize stamp duty in the economy is also an opportunity. So to that extent, yes, there's still room or there's opportunity. But I think any person who has been honest will tell you that government revenue is going to be significantly impacted for 2020 and probably into 2021.
Now, part of the finance bill asks that non-resident companies with significant economic presence in Nigeria into the tax net or will be dragged into the tax net. How can you give us a sense of how this works? How do you even truly define a company with significant economic presence?
Okay, the definition of significant economic presence has been set out in the significant economic presence order, which was issued by the minister. And there are a number of, parameters. The first, of course, is the income threshold. If you have an income threshold of 25 million naira or above, then, that is termed significant economic presence. If you provide certain services into Nigeria, if you provide your services in a certain way, if you use a Nigerian domain, you have a website, you have a www.ng website and all of that, you provide intermediation services and all. So there are clear rules for determining what significant economic presence is. The challenge with taxing companies in the digital economy is not so much in defining what they do, but is actually in capturing what they do within the Nigerian tax net. And I think that is one area, again, that maybe we need to encourage the Federal Ministry of Finance and the Federal Land Revenue Service to do some more public consultation and, of course, to bring in those persons who actually understand how that particular sector works. So one of the challenges, again, is that these companies do not have any physical presence in Nigeria. How do we begin to determine what they actually earn in Nigeria? I think to the extent that they transact business, to business, B2B, it might be easier. But when people, for example, individuals subscribe to some of these digital services, it is a lot much more difficult to be able to capture them within the Nigerian tax net. I see that there has been some effort in the finance bill, of course, to say that, for some of those who are involved in providing technical, professional, and management services, withholding tax, will be the final tax. In that sense, it's easier to implement. So what then happens is that if anyone, a non-resident company provides a technical service to myself or to you, we will then be responsible for deducting the withholding tax and remitting it. That is easier to implement. But then what happens if, for example, I subscribe to Netflix or to YouTube and any of these other platforms? An individual sitting down in Argungu or in Elisha or somewhere, how does the tax authority identify that particular transaction and bring it into the tax net? Now, in the Finance Bill 2020, or is it 2021, there has been a provision to say that the Federal Inland Revenue Service can appoint a payment platform, a payment service provider or a payment gateway to be responsible for deducting such taxes. So I still feel that, there's need to really speak to the industry itself, speak to the industry operators, understand how this industry operates in terms of its payments, the transactions, and the agreements, so that government can then work out a proper template for taxing them. Otherwise, we'll continue to lose the opportunity to tax that particular sector of the economy, irrespective of all the rules that have been made. I mean, the reality is that rules are only as good as they are implemented. So if we have all the best rules to capture significant economic presence in Nigeria, but we don't have a proper implementation framework, then we may not be able to realize the value that we think we can from that particular sector.
Now, sometime in April this year, the federal government had opted for tax deferral rather than tax reduction, stating at the time that tax deduction might not really have the desired effect. So what could probably be the reason for the government U-turn, as it appears?
No, there hasn't really been a U-turn, sorry. There hasn't been a U-turn in the sense that it's not as if government has given it a reduced taxes. What has happened is that the government has targeted specific areas. So just like we said, petrol price has gone up, cost of transportation within the country has gone up. People have said that one of the reasons why foodstuff prices have significantly increased in the last few months is because the cost of transportation has increased. So what government is saying is that we want to particularly target these areas and reduce the taxes or duties applicable to those areas. For things like the minimum tax, I think it's just a realization that if a company is already in a loss position and you're taxing, you're still insisting that the company should pay taxes, then you want to lessen the burden as significantly as possible. Okay, but generally speaking, I do not think that this particular finance bill is one that you can say is anchored on tax reductions, as it were. What you will say is that, yes, there has been some attempt to ensure that, burden of taxes or duties, are reduced. But even if you quote what the Minister of Finance said in terms of the philosophy of the bill, she said that the bill had, I think, 5 thematic areas. First, she said, was fiscal and tax responsibility, enacting counter-cyclical measures and crisis intervention measures, procurement reforms, and, of course, ease of doing business. So you can see the major focus of the bill itself is not even in terms of tax reductions or tax waivers. But like I said, government is also trying to, be responsive, so that it's not seen as though all it does is take. It's trying to say, okay, we've given you something back, but we all have to come together at this very difficult period in time and see how we can make, things improve. And hopefully we'll begin to see some improvement, in the next fiscal year in terms of both economic activity, tax revenue, and of course, implementation of the provisions of the finance bill when it's passed into law.
Now, let's talk about the role of investors. Now, of course, still looking at the Finance Bill 2020, the president has said that there will be a bill to accompany every annual budget proposal. There's no reduction in value-added tax, of course, which is at 7.5%. But what signal does this send to investors?
Okay, I will say to you that overall, I think, again, even though I don't want to sound as if I'm giving the government too much kudos, but the fact that in the last 2 years, we've had government actually pass a finance bill along with the budget, I think is something that must be commendable. Previously, we haven't seen this. I think the last time we had the finance bill or decree was in 1996, prior to last year. So I think in terms of government trying to respond to developments annually by way of a finance bill, it is a positive one. Now, the contents of the bill is a different kettle of fish, but I think if I'm an investor, I'll be looking into the country, economy, and saying, well, at the very least, what happens in Nigeria is that annually there is some form of legislative response to economic development. And so that may give me some comfort to say, even if there's something that I disagree with in the law, or there's something that I find unfavorable to my business, I may just have to wait it out or sit it out for the next 12 months. And there's every chance that if the Finance Bill 2022 is passed, I can influence it, or at least I can get something in there. So to that extent, I think we're not sending a bad message out to investors. But I think anyone who expected a reduction in VAT in 2021, when we just increased VAT in 2020, would not have had a reasonable expectation. Like I said, government is out there looking for revenue. You and I know that government has had to leverage a lot of debt and all of that. So if there was sufficient, if government could get all the money it needed within this economy, it would have looked for it. But it has to, of course, to also, work with the realities on ground. So it is not, I don't think it was an expectation from any quarter that there will be a VAT reduction. But the message out there for investors, I think, is that we have a government that tries to respond to activities or to developments annually, and we do this by our finance bill. So if you're an investor and you think you have a significant concern about some tax or fiscal issue in Nigeria, what you may be thinking to yourself is, well, I have a 12-month cycle to do that. And so I think to that extent, we can commend the government for that. But now, again, maybe one thing that needs to be said is that there needs to be a bit more of public consultation. So even the current finance bill that is in circulation, we've only had about a week or two of public consultation. I would have preferred probably if government or the Ministry of Finance had done, maybe a 3-month cycle, had people, both consultants, people from manufacturing, aviation, all sectors look at this bill and say, look, this is where we think we have a problem. Can you try to accommodate what the concerns are for our own particular industry? And then have a holistic document that is then owned by everybody. Notwithstanding, I believe that there will be opportunities to discuss the bill further at the National Assembly when it's time for public hearing. And of course, I believe that the National Assembly will be responsive enough to listen to complaints or comments on the bill and probably incorporate them in the bill before it is passed into law.
We do appreciate your time. Associate Director at Anderson Tax, Mr. Michael Ango, thank you for sharing some of your time with us this morning.
Thank you, BC. It's a pleasure to be here.